Hey folks, Kostya here, going over my games from the recently concluded Bay Area International. This was a really strong tournament held just outside of San Francisco in Burlingame, if you're familiar with the Bay Area. And it was a really strong tournament. There was like over 20 GMs, a lot of IMs and young juniors. There were some norms made and a lot of really high quality games. My tournament did not go too great. I finished with 4.5 out of 9, playing down most of my rounds, so I had a pretty rough event. But there was a lot to learn from the game, so I'm going to be showing some of my games, highlighting some of the instructive moments, and hopefully you guys will find it interesting. In round 1, I was playing white against National Master Seth Talyansky, and I think he's around 16 or 17 years old. So it seemed like a pretty decent player. I played d4, and he went for the Slav defense, knight f3, knight f6, e3. I've played the system a bunch of times before, so I kind of stuck to what I typically do here. E6, so he indicates he's kind of okay with a semi-Slav if white plays knight c3. But one of the points behind the system is that against the semi-Slav, white can be a lot more flexible. So we have moves like b3, bishop d3, and knight d2 are all playable and opt for some kind of improved version compared to just playing knight c3. I went with bishop d3, knight bd7, and b3. And I'm trying to get my bishop to b2 and take full control over the e5 square. And he gave this check on b4, which was kind of annoying because I know the main line's supposed to be knight bd2, and then black typically goes bishop c3 first, or e5 takes, and then bishop c3. And I just couldn't remember anything about this line during the game, so I decided not to go for it. Like, I don't know if white's supposed to be fighting for a small advantage, big advantage, if black's play is like dubious, or if this is like the main line. After the game I found out this is like mainline theory, and probably black is okay here. In any case, you know, against low rated players I typically don't want to go into some sharp theory if I don't really know it that well. So I decided to just play bishop d2, which is considered kind of a safer choice but also less ambitious, because now when black goes back, white can no longer put the bishop on b2 where I would like, and because I can't do this, black is going to be able to play e5 very quickly. So giving the check on b4 definitely has some value for black. In any case, I wasn't too bothered by this. I'm not familiar with this position exactly, but it seemed like pretty straightforward to play. White should just put the pieces in the center and then eventually try to break with e4. Okay, so he plays rook e8, kind of indicating he's ready to play e5. So I played queen c2, and then queen e7. The point of queen c2 is that, okay, the queen is well placed here, but I'm also controlling the e4 square. So if black had played e5, I would take on d5, as white typically likes to do, and black can't play e4 here, just doesn't have enough covering it. Instead, black has to recapture, then I can take on e5, or I think I can throw a knight b5, bishop b8, I take on e5, and eventually black gets left with this isolated queen pawn, and white can claim some kind of like small advantage here, just based on playing against the pawn on d5. I do have to watch out for some kind of like bishop takes h2 sacrifices here, but I think they're not quite working for black. At least according to the engine, white is doing quite okay here, so I assume bishop takes h2 check, probably not working. Well, he decided not to go for e5 right away. He played queen e7, then I break with e4. Now if black takes on e4, I think he just ends up slightly worse. Knight f6, let's say bishop d3, and it's hard to develop the light squared bishop for black. Key idea for white is, let's say b6, rook e1, bishop b7, I'll put the bishop on c3, then after c5, d5, black gets the main pawn break in the position c5, but if white is able to meet this with d5, usually means white just has a fantastic position, because now there's just a lot of pressure against the e-file, knight on f6, pawn on h7, etc., and black is just kind of in trouble here. So after e4, he does the right thing. He takes on c4 instead. I play bishop takes c4, and then he played b5 and e5. So b5 was pretty important. If black had just played e5 right away, I actually found this line during the game, and then I checked it afterwards, and it is working. White can go knight g5 here, hitting f7, rook f8 is kind of forced, and then the idea is to play f4. And it's a pretty thematic break. It's one that's worth knowing for d4 players when you're fighting against this e5 pawn. You play f4, and then you're ready to push e5 against any capture. So e takes d4, white plays e5. If d takes c3, I think during the game I was just going to calmly recapture with bishop takes. And I think white is just getting huge initiative here. I mean, we're going to be winning back our piece, and we're also threatening, let's say, to take twice and give checkmate on h7. I mean, it's still complicated. Like, black can even give bishop c5 check, but king h1 and nothing has really changed. Knight on f6 can't move because mate on h7 is hanging, and I think white is just getting the piece back and then keeping big initiative. Okay, so b5, pushing the bishop back to d3, and now e5, and I played knight e2. So I think black's position here is kind of reasonable, but I was also happy here with white because my plan is pretty straightforward. I just want to put the knight on g3, try to jump to f5, black will probably play g6, and then I'll put a rook on e1, and then maybe at some point put like queen c1, and eventually move the bishop out of the way and try to get the queen to h6, something like that. It's typically how white plays these positions. The knight goes to g3, you induce this move g6, then you try to make something happen on the weakened dark squares. So yeah, I was expecting a move like bishop b7 here and then knight g3 and we would get this type of position. Instead, black really surprised me with this move c5, which I just wasn't expecting at all. But it is a pawn sacrifice, and I think it's kind of interesting. During the game, I felt like it's very unlikely that black should be getting enough compensation here, and I think this is kind of the correct evaluation of the position. But I still had to kind of demonstrate that white can take on c5, take on b5, and then kind of prove that you know, the extra pawn can be made felt. So I took on c5, knight c5, bishop takes b5. I kind of thought black would play bishop d7 here, which to me makes sense because, okay, normally we don't want to trade pieces when we're sacrificing a pawn and playing for the initiative, but it's a nice tempo for black to just offer the trade of bishops. Then after bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, the rooks are connected, and like rook ac8 is coming. It seems like black has some ideas of just like putting pressure on the e4 pawn and at least posing some problems for white. In the game, I was actually planning on playing knight c3 here, but after rook c1, rook e1, and like quiet move bishop f8, you know, Stockfish feels like black just has full compensation here. I think the d3 square is kind of weak, black has like rook d8, and of course the pin on the c file is pretty annoying to deal with. So instead, white should probably play knight g3 in this position, so the knight defends e4 this way, but is not such a target on c3 and can still jump to f5. And then if rook ac8, threatening knight takes e4, white has queen b1. And I think white is keeping the advantage here. I can like improve my position, as you can see with h3, rook d1. Eventually the bishop can come to e3 or g5. And yeah, black isn't really getting enough for the pawn here. The queen on b1 is kind of awkwardly placed, but I think it's a somewhat temporary setback. Okay, in any case, black just played rook f8 in the game, just keeping more pieces on the board, but also giving white a tempo to kind of consolidate the position. So here I did play knight g3. I felt like this was more solid, and I want the knight to have opportunities of jumping to f5. Black played queen b7, hitting the bishop and the e-pawn, so I'm kind of forced to play bishop d3, defending both. Now if black takes this bishop, I wasn't too sad about giving this one up because I also get rid of one of black's more active pieces, and now I feel like white just has a pretty healthy extra pawn. And black's light scored bishop, you know, it's not on b7 yet, so I still have some time here to play like moves like bishop c3, and yeah, I think white is just much better. Okay, so bishop g4 was played, and black is kind of half threatening to take on f3, although to be honest, I wasn't too concerned about taking and recapturing with the g-pawn, because then it would really strengthen my e4 pawn, and I think my king would be perfectly safe on h1 or g2 anyway. Not to mention I would then get the f5 square for my knight. So I think I played a good move here, bishop g5, and now I'm just basically saying, okay, if you double my pawns, I'll double yours, and we'll see who can make better use of those kingside weaknesses. I actually was expecting bishop takes f3 here, after which I could take on f6 first, and then we would both get this structure. And I think white should be better here because of the extra pawn, but now the position, is like starting to simplify, and there are chances of getting some kind of position with like opposite color bishops that might be hard to convert in the long run. So back here after bishop takes f3, I think more likely I was just going to play g takes f3, especially because I found a cool line here. I figured black would likely play knight to e6, hitting the bishop, and also hitting or threatening knight to d4, and then hitting the f3 pawn. Bishop takes f6 would be my move. Then I figured black might throw in knight d4. And instead of the kind of obvious move queen d1, just defending the pawn, then g takes f6, and okay, white should be better, but it's still not that easy to convert this. I have a much better move, queen c1. So I'm just giving up the f3 pawn because I realized that once black is taking on f6, white's queen can just come to h6, and then knight h5 is coming, and black's king is just getting mated, so the f3 pawn just doesn't matter whatsoever. So that line would have just been very clearly winning for white. I think my opponent spent some time here, eventually decided against it. Not sure what exactly he didn't like, but he comes up with probably a better move, knight h5, because this is at least keeping more chances for black on the board. Okay, knight h5, I trade knights because I'm up a pawn, so why not? And I played knight d2, just kind of getting away from this threat of bishop takes f3. And now I felt quite happy here because I'm going to get my bishop to c4, which I thought would be a very nice square. One day, hopefully plant it on d5 and then maybe bring the knight to c4. I felt like if I could get that, then black would just have no compensation. He played rook a c8. I put my bishop on c4, knight e6, bishop e3. And now if knight d4 or knight f4, I had no problem with just taking off the knight and putting my queen on d3 and just playing with the extra pawn here. And I felt like black in no way is going to get enough here because I can just build up with f4 and knight f3 and e5, and I think white's play here is just super easy. Instead he played the move bishop b4, which was kind of annoying because he's somewhat threatening to just take on d2 and then take the e4 pawn. And he also has ideas of maybe even just building up with rook to d8 and just putting a lot of pressure on white's position. So I took a long think here, and I came up with I think a very nice idea. One of my issues that I've been struggling with in my chess for the past, I would say maybe several years, is my poor technique. Whenever I'm like up a pawn or up material, I do a very bad job of like converting those positions without allowing counter chances. In this game, I think I did an okay job. I decided to play the move queen b2 here. So first thing is that I'm kind of getting out of the pin from the c file, so now I'm potentially threatening bishop d5 and then knight c4 and just completely unraveling. And the main point is that, okay, after bishop takes d2, I'm giving back the e4 pawn, or giving back my extra pawn, in order to kind of simplify the position and reach a position where I have like two very strong bishops. So I felt like this was a good general decision, just to give back the extra pawn, but get this very, very pleasant position where I can still try to get an extra pawn in the future, as the a7 pawn is going to be a long-term weakness. Okay, but this one was pretty interesting because, to be honest, my original intention here was to play bishop takes d2, the point being that queen takes e4, I could just play some rook to e1, maybe rook a e1, and then even take the e5 pawn. But then at the board, once I got to this position and I was kind of double checking my calculations, I suddenly noticed that bishop takes d2 is going to run into rook takes c4, and white just blunders a full piece. So in time, I kind of corrected my thinking and played queen takes d2, which wasn't really my original intention. But it kind of shows that my form in this tournament was probably not great. It has been a couple months since I last played over the board serious chess, and I think maybe this was a sign of bad things to come, as I've almost blundered a pretty elementary tactic. Anyway, I figured it out in time. I played queen takes d2, black regains the pawn on e4, and I decided to just play rook f e1. I didn't want to take the a7 pawn just yet. I didn't even consider it that much, to be honest, as I felt like I really need my bishop on e4, on e3, making sure that if the knight ever comes to f4, I can just trade it off so that it doesn't cause me too much damage. In any case, I like rook e1 just kind of developing the rook and forcing black's queen to move away. He played queen g6 here. I realized pretty quickly his idea is to play bishop f3, of course, and just try to create a lot of counterplay on the light squares. And here I also thought, okay, his next move might also be something like rook d8. And so I had to kind of take some time here to figure out what's the best way to continue for white. Eventually I decided on really natural move king h1, just avoiding the threat of bishop f3 altogether. But I also set kind of a nice trap here that my opponent ends up walking into. So I play king h1. He decides to go rook cd8 to keep his f rook perhaps ready to join in case I ever take, and maybe he plays f takes c6, or in some future maybe he might even want to play f5 with black. So he keeps this rook on f8. I don't think it really matters because after either rook going to d8, my idea was to play queen a5. So now I'm hitting the a7 pawn, I'm hitting the e5 pawn. I figured he was likely to play knight d4, which he ends up doing. The point being that after bishop takes d4, e takes d4. If I take this a7 pawn, I get my extra pawn back, but after d3, well, black gets some very real counterplay with this d pawn, and now he's starting to push d2. Bishop on h5 is suddenly in the game and very active. So this would be, to my eyes, very unclear. Instead, my idea was, actually kind of just saw a tactic ahead of time that most likely he missed. The time control for this tournament was 40 moves in 90 minutes, with 30 minutes added after that, and 30-second increment for move 1. So pretty standard time control, but I think by this point he was down to like under 5 minutes, maybe under 10 minutes. So, you know, he was already getting pretty low on time. Anyway, if you wanted to pause the video and try to find the winning move for white, now would be your chance. But the move was rook e5. Somewhat unexpected, but it leads to a very nice kind of geometrical motive. The rook and queen line up to hit the bishop on h5. Black is kind of forced to play bishop g4, and then I have rook g5. And it seems like black is losing the bishop. So here's another interesting moment that kind of highlights what kind of form I was in during this tournament. Originally, I felt like, okay, he has to play queen e4 here. And then my idea was to play rook to e1, which I felt was very nice because it's like defended by the queen. The queen is defending this rook, just like all my pieces are very nicely protected. And it looked like black was just losing the piece. I hadn't noticed until after the game that he would still have this move queen f4 and just like defending the bishop and actually keeping quite a reasonable position for himself, because white is not really winning anything at this point. Hopefully in the game, had queen e4 had been played, I would have double checked my calculations again, spotted that this queen f4 move is possible, and just played the somewhat risky but much more simple move f3, which wins the piece for 2 pawns. Black can of course get this somewhat annoying check-in, but after rook g2, there's not really going to be enough compensation here because I don't think black has enough with the d pawn. Like for example d3, white could probably just play queen d2 and then bring the other rook to g1 and slowly unravel and consolidate. And okay, still some work to be done, but I think white should be winning this one quite handedly. In any case, black played queen f6. I mean, given all that, queen e4 is definitely, I think, a better try, because at least even if I play f3, he can get 2 pawns for the piece and be somewhat annoying to my king. Queen f6, I think, poses some issues, but the game was not hard to win from here. I just took the bishop immediately. He played d3, rook d1, d2. And here, I mean, white has just like a full extra piece, but there are still ways to go wrong. For example, one of the moves I considered in this position, bishop e2, would simply walk into rook fe8, after which white actually doesn't have any good moves here, because rook e1 is in the air, and if I play a move like queen b5, then black can likely just take this f2 pawn, and it's just very hard to deal with this threat of rook e1 coming, so I think white might just be in trouble. Seems like the engine wants to play queen e5 as well, which is kind of, that's kind of an interesting idea too, and I don't see a way out for white. After takes, and then rook e1 coming. This rook on g4 just feels completely misplaced. So yeah, there are definitely some ways to go wrong here, so I tried to just be as technical as possible. And I think I found a good solution here. I brought my rook back to e4. I felt like, okay, now I'm preventing him from playing rook f e8. And after queen takes f2, I have rook to e2. My back rank is still nicely covered, and I'm ready to just take on d2 next move, followed by queen takes d2, and just pick up his d-pawn. So black resigned here because he just has no way of continuing the game. Like queen f4 or queen d4, I can take on d2, and there are no back rank tricks or anything like that. And that was it. So definitely not a perfect game. I had some weird miscalculations, but I feel like I played pretty well. I took the pawn that was sacrificed, kind of neutralized black's initiative, and eventually simplified and found this nice idea with rook e5 to take the piece. Okay, so round one was a win, kind of at least relatively smooth to my other games, and in round two I would be playing up, so stay tuned for that. Thanks a lot for watching this video. If you'd like to get the PGN of the game with some of my annotations and analysis, all of my games will be up on my Patreon page, and I'll include a link in the description below for those of you that haven't seen that yet. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.